flashlight beam cut through the darkness of Willowbrook State School's abandoned corridors, illuminating peeling paint and rusted wheelchairs left where they had been abandoned years before. The summer night pressed against broken windows, thick with humidity and the sound of cicadas. Somewhere in the overgrown grounds, beneath tangled vines and rotting leaves, the earth had been disturbed. Detective John Mahoney stood at the edge of the woods onto Staten Island's forgotten eastern shore, watching officers mark the perimeter with yellow tape. July 1987 had arrived, with temperatures climbing into the 90s, but the ground beneath his boots felt cold. They had found Jennifer Schweiger 12 days after she disappeared from her family's campground less than 2 miles away. 12 days of turchining through summer heat. 12 days of hoping. The girl was 12 years old and had Down syndrome. She could not speak, she trusted easily. And now, in the shadow of the institution where thousands of disabled children had once been warehoused and forgotten, where scandals had closed the doors but left the buildings to rot, where local children whispered about a hook-handed maniac named Cropsey, who lived in the tunnels, the legend had become flesh. The search was over, the investigation had just begun, and Staten Island would learn that sometimes the monsters in the campfire stories are real. Chapter 1, The Island at the Edge. Good evening, and welcome to the Bedside Historian. The night settles around you now, wherever you find yourself in this quiet hour. Perhaps you are in New York or somewhere far beyond, but the darkness we share is the same. Before we begin, tell me in the comments below where are you listening from and what time has brought you here. And if this is your first time joining us in the shadows of history, consider subscribing. We have many more stories waiting in the dark. Let us drift backwards now to the summer of 1987, to an island at the edge of New York City that felt in many ways like the edge of the world itself. Staten Island stretched across the harbour from Manhattan like a country unto itself, connected to the great metropolis by a single bridge to Brooklyn and the orange ferry that cut through the water every half hour. In the late 20th century it remained the forgotten borough, the place where the city's memory went to fade. While Manhattan climbed upward in steel and glass, and Brooklyn pulsed with brownstone renewal, Staten Island kept to itself, a landscape of marshland and forest, of neighbourhoods separated by woods so thick they swallowed sound. The island measured some 14 miles long and 8 miles wide, shaped like a rough triangle pointed toward New Jersey across the Arthur Hill Strait. Its population hovered near 300,000 souls, but they were scattered across hills and valleys that felt nothing like city density. Here were single-family homes with yards, streets that ended in dirt, paths, stretches of shore where the only sound came from wind moving through beach grass. The northern shore faced Manhattan across the Narrows, close enough to see the towers but far enough to feel removed from their shadow. The eastern shore, where our story unfolds, looked toward nothing but marsh and water, toward the wasteland of old industrial sites and institutions that had been built there precisely because they sat far from the city's gaze. To reach Staten Island in those years required intention. The Verrazano Narrows Bridge deposited travellers onto streets that led to neighbourhoods with names like New Dorp and Tottenville, Great Kills and Prince's Bay. These were not the anonymous grid blocks of Manhattan, but distinct villages, each with its own character, its own memory. Families had lived here for generations, children played in woods their grandparents had played in. The island kept its secrets close. The eastern portion of Staten Island, where the land rose into wooded hills and then fell away toward marshland, had always served as the borough's dumping ground for what the city wished to forget. Here stood the massive mounds of the Fresh Kills landfill, accepting garbage from all 5 boroughs, growing higher year by year until the hills of trash became visible from aeroplanes approaching Newark. Here too had risen the institutions, the asylums and hospitals and homes for those whom society preferred to keep at a distance. The Seaview Hospital and Home for Consumptives, the Farm Colony for the Mentally Ill, and largest of all, Willowbrook State School, which sprawled across 375 acres of what had once been farmland, a city of buildings dedicated to the warehousing of children with developmental disabilities. By 1987, Willowbrook had been closed for years, its residents transferred elsewhere after scandals had forced the state's hand. But the buildings remained, dozens of them, spreading across the hilltop like the ruins of some abandoned civilization. The city had no plan for them. Nature was reclaiming the grounds slowly. Vines climbed brick walls. Windows broke in storms and stayed broken. Doors hung open. And in those empty corridors and basement tunnels, in the cafeterias where nothing had been served for over a decade, shadows moved that were not quite shadows. The neighborhoods surrounding this eastern shore were working-class enclaves where families saved to buy small houses with small yards. In summer, when the heat of the city became unbearable and vacation money was scarce, these families sought refuge in the campgrounds that dotted Staten Island's interior. The Seaview campground sat among the woods less than 2 miles from the Willowbrook grounds, a collection of RV sites and tent platforms where parents could give their children a taste of outdoor life without leaving the borough. It was not wilderness, not truly, but it offered the illusion of escape, the pleasure of a campfire and marshmallows while remaining close enough to home that fathers could still drive to work on Monday morning. In the summer of 1987, Staten Island sweltered under temperatures that climbed into the 90s and stayed there for days. The humidity pressed down from the harbour, turning the air thick as water. Children sought relief in the spray of fire hydrants and the public pools that smelled of chlorine. Families at the Seaview campground retreated to the shade of the oaks and pines, emerging only in the early evening when the heat broke enough to allow movement. The island in those years existed in a strange temporal space, caught between the old New York and the new. The drug epidemic that had consumed the Bronx and parts of Brooklyn had not yet fully taken hold here, though its advance was visible in certain neighborhoods. The crime wave that had made the city synonymous with danger through the 1970s and early 1980s had begun to recede, but the memory remained fresh. Parents still warned children about strangers. Doors that had once remained unlocked through summer nights now had deadbolts. The city had taught vigilance, and even in this most suburban of boroughs, that lesson held. Yet Staten Island maintained its own mythology, separate from the city's broader narrative. The island had always been a place of stories, of legends passed between children, of places declared haunted or forbidden. Every neighborhood had its abandoned house, its stretch of woods where something terrible had supposedly happened. The isolation that defined the borough, that sense of being apart from the city proper, created space for these tales to grow. And no story held greater power among Staten Island children than the legend of Cropsey. The name itself came from nowhere and everywhere, a variation perhaps on the old Cropsey Avenue in Brooklyn, or a corruption of some forgotten surname. But on Staten Island, Cropsey was not a street or a person. Cropsey was the monster. The hook-handed maniac who lived in the tunnels beneath Willowbrook. The escaped mental patient who snatched children who wandered too far into the woods. The bogeyman who gave shape to every fear that darkness contained. At summer camps and backyard sleepovers, the story was told and retold, embellished and refined, until every child on the island knew that Cropsey was real, that he waited in the abandoned buildings of the old institution, that he could smell when children came near. The legend served its purpose as such legends always do. It kept children from wandering. It gave parents a name to invoke when warning against the dangers of exploring the ruins. It transformed the very real hazard of abandoned buildings and broken glass and unstable floors into something almost manageable, something with a face and a name that could be avoided if one simply stayed away. But in the summer of 1987, something happened that no campfire story had prepared anyone for. The line between legend and reality, between the monster in the tale and the monsters that walk among us, began to blur. The children of Staten Island would learn what their parents had always feared, that the most terrible stories are terrible precisely because they contain truth. That sometimes, when darkness falls and the woods grow quiet, the thing that waits in the shadows has a name after all. The island at the edge of the city was about to remember what it had tried so hard to forget. In the abandoned halls of Willowbrook, where thousands of children had suffered and been forgotten, Where scandal had closed doors but left the building standing, history was preparing to repeat itself in the cruelest possible way. The summer heat pressed down. Families sought escape in the campgrounds. Children played among the trees. And in the ruins of the old institution, something stirred that had been stirring for years, patient and persistent, waiting for the moment when opportunity and impulse would align once more. The story of Cropsey, the legend that had frightened generations of Staten Island children, was about to become something far worse than a story. It was about to become memory. It was about to become grief. It was about to become the thing that parents would speak of in lowered voices for decades to come, the name that would never quite lose its power to chill even in daylight, even among those who claimed not to believe in monsters. Staten Island in 1987 stood at the edge of this transformation, unknowing and unprepared. The heat would break eventually. The summer would end. But what happened in those July weeks would mark the borough forever, would draw a line between before and after, would prove that sometimes the campfire tales we tell to scare each other contain prophecies we would have done anything not to fulfill. Chapter 2. The Willowbrook Years. The institution opened on October 17, 1947, built on land that had served as an army base during the Second World War. The federal government had constructed Camp Willowbrook to house soldiers bound for European battlefields, rows of single-story barracks spreading across Staten Island hillside property that offered both space and isolation. When the war ended and the soldiers came home, the building stood empty only briefly. New York State saw opportunity in those vacant structures. The city had too many children with nowhere to go, children whose disabilities made them unwelcome in schools and burdensome to families already struggling in cramped tenements. The state needed somewhere to put them. The army barracks would serve. Willowbrook State School for the Mentally Retarded, as it was formally named, was intended to house 4,000 residents. This number was calculated based on the existing buildings and the amount of staffing the state believed it could reasonably provide. The children who came in those early years arrived with conditions that spanned the full spectrum of developmental disability. Some had Down syndrome. Others had been born with cerebral palsy or suffered brain damage during difficult births. Some had seizure disorders, some had been classified as mentally retarded, based on intelligence tests administered by school systems eager to remove difficult students from overcrowded classrooms. Some had been sent by families who simply could not manage another mouth to feed in households where poverty was already grinding them down. And some, it would later be discovered, had no significant disability at all beyond being unwanted. The state promised modern facilities. It promised trained staff and educational programs. It promised medical care and a chance at dignity for children who had been hidden away in attics and basements, institutionalized in worse conditions, or simply abandoned. Parents who brought their children to Willowbrook in those first years often wept with relief, believing they were doing the right thing, providing their sons and daughters with opportunities they could never offer at home. The population grew quickly. By 1950, 5,000 children lived at Willowbrook. By 1955, that number had climbed past 6,000. The buildings designed for 4,000 soldiers, young and able-bodied, now held 1.5 times that number in children who required constant supervision and care. The state responded not by limiting admissions, but by crowding more beds into existing spaces. Day rooms meant for 20 residents held 50. Sleeping quarters designed for 30 held 60, with beds pressed so close together that there was barely room to walk between them. Staffing never matched the population increase. The ratio of caretakers to residents grew more dire each year. By the early 60s, some wards operated with a single attendant responsible for 75 or more children. These attendants were not trained nurses or special education teachers. They were custodial staff, often poorly paid men and women who had taken the job because few other options existed. Their task was not to educate or rehabilitate. Their task was to keep the children alive and contained. The conditions that developed were inevitable once the mathematics of overcrowding and understaffing had been set in motion. Children sat in soiled clothing for hours because there was no one to change them. Meals were eaten standing up in some wards because there were not enough chairs. The smell of urine and feces permeated the buildings, soaking into the walls until it became permanent. Children with seizure disorders lay on floors without padding. Those who could not feed themselves often went hungry if no staff member had time to help. The youngest residents, toddlers sent to Willowbrook because their parents had been told the institution could provide what they could not, spent their days in cribs with nothing to occupy them but the ceiling above and the sounds of other children crying. Violence was common. The older, more capable residents bullied the younger and more vulnerable ones. Staff members, overwhelmed and underpaid, sometimes responded to difficult children with force. Sexual abuse occurred in wards where supervision was minimal and victims were non-verbal. Children died from choking on food, from injuries sustained in falls, from infections that went untreated, from complications of seizures that no one witnessed in time to help. The institution had been designed with the assumption that the children housed there would remain there. Few programs existed to prepare residents for any kind of independent living. The emphasis was on containment, on keeping these children out of sight and out of mind. Willowbrook became a warehouse, and the children became inventory, tracked by numbers on wristbands, noted in ledgers, but rarely known as individuals with names and personalities and potential. The state inspected periodically. Reports were filed noting deficiencies. Recommendations were made for improvements, and then the inspectors left and nothing changed. Willowbrook continued to accept new admissions. The population continued to grow. By 1965, the institution held over 6,000 residents, nearly all of them children, in buildings that had been inadequate for 4,000. Parents who visited their children began to notice the deterioration. They saw the bruises, the weight loss, the vacant stares that suggested something had broken inside. But challenging the institution meant admitting they had made a mistake in sending their children there. And for many families, there was still nowhere else to go. Group homes and community programs barely existed. Public schools refused to accept children with significant disabilities. Taking a child home from Willowbrook often meant one parent would have to quit working to provide full-time care, a financial impossibility for families already at the margins. So the children stayed, and the parents visited when they could bear it, and the years passed. By the late 1960s, Willowbrook had become the largest institution of its kind in the world. It employed nearly 2,000 workers and operated on a budget of millions of dollars annually. Yet the money never seemed to reach the children. Buildings fell into disrepair, roofs leaked. Heating systems failed in winter. The food budget calculated out to less than $1 per resident per day. Medical equipment was outdated or broken. The pharmacy dispensed medications without proper oversight, sometimes tranquilizing difficult children into stupors that made them easier to manage. Then came in 1972, and with it, the moment when the secret could no longer be kept. A young television reporter named Geraldo Rivera had received a tip from a physician named Michael Wilkins, who worked at Willowbrook and was horrified by what he witnessed daily. Dr. Wilkins provided Rivera with access to the institution, and in January of 1972, Rivera and his camera crew entered Willowbrook with permission to film. What they captured would be broadcast to millions of Americans and would change the national conversation about how society treated its most vulnerable citizens. The footage showed children naked on the floors of overcrowded wards, lying in their own waste. It showed young people with untreated sores and injuries. It showed a day room where dozens of children sat rocking back and forth with nothing to occupy them. No toys, no activities, no stimulation beyond the four walls that contained them. Rivera's voice narrated what the camera revealed, and his anger was audible. This was not care. This was not treatment. This was warehousing at best and abuse at worst, conducted with state funding and state sanction in one of the wealthiest states in the nation. The broadcast aired on WABC TV in New York on January 6, 1972. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. Willowbrook became a national scandal. Newspapers ran investigative pieces. Congressional hearings were scheduled. parents who had believed their children were receiving proper care, arrived at the institution demanding to see the wards for themselves. Protests were organized. Senator Robert Kennedy had toured Willowbrook in 1965 and called it a snake pit, but his voice had been one among many. Now, with video evidence broadcast into living rooms across the country, the truth could not be denied or explained away. The state promised reform. New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller pledged improvements. Funding was allocated. But institutions are slow to change, and Willowbrook was no exception. Staff were hired, but experienced workers were difficult to find and retain at the wages offered. Buildings were renovated, but the fundamental problem of overcrowding remained. The population began to decrease slowly, as some residents were transferred to smaller facilities or returned to families, but thousands still remained. In 1875, the federal government intervened. A class action lawsuit filed on behalf of Willowbrook residents resulted in a consent decree that mandated sweeping changes. The institution would have to reduce its population dramatically. Residents would have to receive individualized treatment plans. Staff ratios would have to improve. The state would have to create community-based alternatives so that people with developmental disabilities could live in group homes and receive services there rather than being institutionalized. The process of emptying Willowbrook took years. Through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, residents were gradually moved out. Buildings were closed. Their populations consolidated into fewer and fewer wards. By 1987, only a handful of residents remained in a small section of the campus, and plans were being made to close the institution entirely. The rest of the buildings stood empty, their doors chained shut, their windows broken by vandals and weather. The state had no clear plan for what to do with the structures. They were too expensive to demolish and too controversial to repurpose, so they simply stood there, monuments to a system that had failed comprehensively and publicly. But Willowbrook's buildings, though empty, were not abandoned entirely. The grounds were too large to patrol effectively. The fences had gaps. The chains on doors could be broken or bypassed. And in those empty corridors and basement tunnels, in the day rooms where children had once rocked in silence, and the dormitories where they had slept pressed together against the cold, other inhabitants began to take shelter. Homeless men found their way into the buildings, seeking protection from winter weather. Drug users discovered places where they could use in privacy. Teenagers came to explore and vandalize, to spray paint walls and break what remained. And some who came found the place suited them, found that the isolation and the ruins provided exactly what they needed. They stayed. Among those who stayed was a man who had once worked at Willowbrook in its operational years, who knew the layout of the buildings and the best places to hide, who had watched the institution empty out and the staff depart, and who made the ruins his home. His name was Andre Rand, though he had been born with a different name. He had been a custodian at Willowbrook during some of its worst years, and when the residents left and the buildings closed, he did not leave. He remained. The children of Staten Island would create their legend of Cropsey from fear and imagination. But in the empty halls of Willowbrook, something real was taking shape, something that would prove far more terrible than any campfire story, because it was not a story at all. It was a man, and he was waiting. Chapter 3. The Legend of Cropsey. The story was told at night. Always at night, when darkness had settled and the campfire had burned down to embers that cast more shadow than light. The children would gather close, and one among them, usually an older child, who had heard the tale before and knew how to tell it with the proper pauses and lowered voice, would begin. There were variations in the telling, details that changed depending on who spoke, but the essential elements remained constant. Cropsey was real. Cropsey was dangerous. And Cropsey was waiting in the ruins of Willowbrook for children foolish enough to wander near. In some versions, Cropsey had been an attendant at the institution, a cruel man who had abused the residents in his care until the day one of them fought back and wounded him terribly. He lost his hand in the struggle and a hook was fitted in its place. When Willowbrook closed and he lost his job, he refused to leave, taking up residence in the tunnels beneath the buildings where he could continue his reign of terror over anyone who entered his domain. In other versions, Cropsey had been a resident himself, a patient driven, more than mad by the conditions at Willowbrook. He escaped during the chaos of the institution's final years and now lived in the abandoned buildings, surviving on whatever he could scavenge or steal. He had developed a taste for violence during his time as a prisoner of the institution, and now that he was free, he acted on impulses that had been suppressed for years. Still other tellings made Cropsey into something less than human, a creature that had been created by the horrors of Willowbrook itself, born from the suffering of all those children who had died in those wards. He was a ghost or a demon, something that could not be killed because it had never truly lived. He appeared when children were alone, when they strayed too far from safety, and he dragged them back to the institution where they would never be found. The hook was a constant across all versions. Cropsey always had a hook where his hand should have been, and that hook served as both weapon and signature. When police found children who had disappeared, the legend said, they would bear marks from that hook, scratches carved into flesh as proof of who had taken them. The hook made Cropsey instantly recognisable even in darkness. The sound of it scraping against stone or metal would be the last thing his victims heard before he struck. The legend was not unique to Staten Island. Variations of the hook-handed killer appeared in urban legends across America, told at summer camps and sleepovers, adapted to local geography and local fears. But on Staten Island, the legend found perfect soil in which to root and grow. The presence of Willowbrook gave the story a specificity that made it more believable than the generic madmen of other versions. Here was an actual abandoned institution with a documented history of horror. Here were real buildings where terrible things had demonstrably happened. Here were tunnels that truly existed beneath the grounds, originally built to house heating pipes and electrical systems, now dark and empty and accessible through rusted grates and broken basement doors. The legend of Cropsey did not require much imagination when the stage on which he supposedly operated was visible from the street, when children could look at those empty buildings on the hill and know that something bad had happened there. Parents did not discourage the legend. In fact, many actively reinforced it. Cropsey became a tool of discipline, a threat that could be invoked to keep children from exploring dangerous places. Do not go near Willowbrook, mothers told their children, or Cropsey will get you. Stay out of the woods after dark, fathers warned, because that is when Cropsey comes out. The legend served a practical purpose in a community where parental supervision could not be constant and where the temptation to explore abandoned buildings was strong among bored teenagers seeking adventure. The story was particularly powerful among younger children, those between the ages of 6 and 12, old enough to roam their neighbourhoods but young enough to still believe in monsters. They told the legend to each other at recess, elaborated on it during sleepovers, frightened siblings with it when parents were not listening. The more the story was told, the more details accumulated. Cropsey drove a white van. Cropsey could see in the dark. Cropsey knew where you lived. Cropsey was watching right now, but the legend predated the name Cropsey by generations. Staten Island had always told stories about its abandoned places. In the 19th century, when tuberculosis sanatoria dotted the eastern shore, children had whispered about the ghosts of consumptives who still wandered the grounds. When the farm colony opened in the early 20th century to house the mentally ill, new legends emerged about escaped patients hiding in the woods. The hook-handed killer was simply the latest iteration of a narrative that had been refining itself for 100 years, adapting to each new institution and each new scandal. The 1970s gave the legend new life. After Geraldo Rivera's expose, every child on Staten Island knew about Willowbrook and the horrors that had occurred there. The adults spoke of it in lowered voices, expressing shock and disgust, but the children absorbed the details and incorporated them into their mythology. The legend of Cropsey became more elaborate after 1972, more specific in its descriptions of what happened to children who were taken. Now they were not simply killed, but imprisoned in the same conditions that Willowbrook's residents had endured, locked in rooms without light, left to suffer the way those thousands of children had suffered. Teenagers used the legend as a dare. Proving one's bravery meant venturing onto the Willowbrook grounds after dark, approaching the buildings, sometimes even entering them if a door could be found unlocked, or a window broken enough to climb through. These expeditions were ritualized, undertaken in groups for safety, with much bravado beforehand and nervous laughter during. The empty wards were genuinely frightening even without belief in Cropsey. The darkness was absolute. The sounds of wind through broken windows and rain on damaged roofs created echoes that resembled voices or footsteps. Paint peeled from walls in patterns that looked like faces, and always there was the knowledge of what had happened here, the weight of history pressing down, making every shadow seem inhabited. Some teenagers claimed to have seen Cropsey during these explorations. They described a figure moving through the buildings, a man who appeared suddenly in doorways or at the end of corridors, watching them before disappearing. These sightings were usually dismissed as imagination or exaggeration, the product of adrenaline and fear making ordinary shapes into something sinister. But occasionally the descriptions were specific enough to give pause. A man with long hair and a beard, a man wearing old clothes, a man who seemed to live in the buildings rather than simply exploring them. These details suggested that perhaps the teenagers were seeing not a legend, but a reality, that someone actually was living in the ruins of Willowbrook, and that the legend had incorporated this truth without quite understanding what it meant. The tunnels beneath the institution were the subject of particular fascination and fear. They ran for miles beneath the grounds, connecting buildings and carrying utilities. In the years when Willowbrook operated, staff and patients rarely used them. They were maintenance spaces, cramped and dark, accessible only through specific entrance points. But after the institution closed, the tunnels became part of the legend. Cropsey lived in the tunnels. He had built a lair there. He had rooms where he kept his victims. The tunnels connected to the sewer system, allowing him to travel beneath the entire island without being seen. The tunnels went all the way to the harbour, giving him an escape route if anyone came looking. Almost none of this was true, but the tunnels did exist and they were accessible, and they were dark in a way that above-ground darkness never quite achieved. The few who had actually explored them reported that they were mostly empty, filled with old pipes and debris, flooded in some sections and collapsed in others. But the reality did not matter. The legend had decided what the tunnels were, and no amount of evidence would change the story. By the 1980s, the legend of Cropsey had become embedded in Staten Island culture. It was not questioned or analysed. It simply was. A fact of childhood on the island is as reliable as the ferry schedule or the smell of the Fresh Kills landfill when the wind blew from the east. Parents who had grown up on Staten Island told their own children the same stories they had been told, updating the details to account for Willowbrook's closure but maintaining the essential narrative. Cropsey was eternal. Cropsey was inevitable. Cropsey was the price of living in a place with institutions like Willowbrook, where society's failures created spaces that spawned both real horror and imagined monsters. The children of Staten Island in 1987 knew the legend as well as they knew their own addresses. They could recite it in perfect detail, adding flourishes that demonstrated their storytelling skill. They used it to frighten each other and to process their own fears about the world, transforming abstract dangers into a concrete threat that had a name and a face and a location that could be avoided. The legend served its purpose. It kept children cautious. It gave parents a tool for discipline. It bound the community together through shared narrative. But legends, like all stories, have power that extends beyond their telling. They shape perception. They create expectation. They prepare the mind to see what the story has taught it to look for. And in the summer of 1987, when children began to disappear from Staten Island neighbourhoods, when the searches spread and the fear mounted and the police began to look for suspects, the legend of Cropsey was waiting, ready to provide explanation and identity to horrors that no one wanted to believe were real. The campfire tale was about to become testimony. The story told to frighten was about to become the story used to convict. And the line between legend and truth already blurred by years of repetition and embellishment, was about to disappear entirely. Chapter 4. The disappearances begin. The first was Alice Pereira. She was 5 years old in the summer of 1972, small for her age, with dark hair and dark eyes and a habit of following her older siblings wherever they went. Her family lived in a modest house in the Port Richmond neighbourhood on Staten Island's northern shore, where the streets ended in views of the Kilvancull waterway. August arrived hot that year, the kind of heat that made asphalt soft and sent children running through sprinklers in their yards. On August 21, Alice left her apartment building to buy groceries for her mother. The store was 3 blocks away, a journey she had made before, though usually with company. This time she went alone. She walked down the sidewalk in the afternoon sun, past neighbours sitting on stoops, past parked cars and fire hydrants, past all the ordinary landmarks of her daily geography. And then she was gone. The family realised she was missing within an hour. Alice's mother had expected her back quickly. When the time stretched beyond what was reasonable, concern became alarm. Alice's father went out to look, walking the route to the store, asking shopkeepers if they had seen his daughter. No one had. He expanded the search, checking the playground, the schoolyard, the homes of relatives. Still nothing. By evening the police were called. Officers canvassed the neighbourhood, knocking on doors, interviewing anyone who might have seen the little girl. A few witnesses remembered seeing Alice walking alone that afternoon. No one remembered seeing her after she passed a certain intersection. She had simply vanished somewhere between her home and the store, absorbed by the city in the space of 3 blocks. The search continued for days. Volunteers combed the neighbourhood and the waterfront, divers checked the waterways. Search dogs tracked Alice's scent to a certain point on the route and then lost it, as if she had been picked up and carried. Posters went up showing her face, offering rewards for information. Her family appeared on local television, pleading for anyone with knowledge to come forward. The community rallied with the mixture of horror and determination that always accompanies the disappearance of a child. But weeks passed, then months, and Alice Pereira remained missing. The investigation continued in the way such investigations do when there are no leads and no body, becoming less active over time but never officially closed. The file remained open. The family kept hoping, and life on Staten Island went on, carrying with it the knowledge that a child had vanished and had not been found. 7 years passed. The case of Alice Pereira became memory, a tragedy that people mentioned when discussing the dangers children faced, but no longer an active source of fear. And then another child disappeared. Holly Ann Hughes was 7 years old in October 1981. She lived with her mother in a neighbourhood on Staten Island's eastern shore, close enough to the Willowbrook grounds that the abandoned buildings were visible from certain streets. Holly Ann was playing in the courtyard of her apartment complex on October 15th, a Thursday afternoon when the October light had already begun its early fade toward evening. Her mother could see her from the apartment window. Other children were playing as well. It was an ordinary afternoon, the kind where parents relaxed their vigilance because the child was visible and close and surrounded by neighbours. Holly Ann left the courtyard to go to a friend's apartment in the same complex. She never arrived. Somewhere in the span of yards between one door and another, in a space that should have been safe because it was known and populated, Holly Ann Hughes disappeared. The response was immediate and massive. Police descended on the apartment complex within minutes of the first call. They searched every unit, every basement, every storage area. They interviewed every resident and visitor. They brought in search dogs and helicopters. The theory was that Holly Ann had been abducted by someone who knew the complex, who had watched and waited for an opportunity, who had taken the child in the brief window when she was alone. But despite the speed of the response and the intensity of the search, no trace of Holly Ann was found. No witnesses came forward with descriptions of suspicious vehicles or strangers. The little girl had simply vanished, and the only certainty was that she had not wandered away on her own. The media coverage was extensive. Holly Ann's face appeared on news broadcasts and in newspapers. Her mother gave interviews. her grief visible and raw, begging for her daughter's return. The case drew comparisons to other abductions, to the patterns that had been emerging nationally, as America became aware that child abduction was more common than anyone had wanted to believe. Photographs of missing children began appearing on milk cartons, hotlines were established. The innocence of the previous generation, when children roamed freely and parents worried less, was giving way to a new era of fear and vigilance. On Staten Island, the disappearance of Holly Ann Hughes reawakened memories of Alice Pereira. 2 children, both young girls, both vanished without trace in neighborhoods that were not known for violent crime. The time span between the cases was significant, but the similarities were troubling. Parents began watching their children more carefully. Rules about playing outside were tightened. The sense of safety that had characterized even working-class Staten Island neighborhoods began to erode. Then came Tia Jackson, 11 years old, who vanished in August of '83 while walking to a bus stop in the Mariners Harbor neighborhood. Her case followed the same pattern. Daylight, familiar route, no witnesses to the abduction, no trace found despite searches. The girl was there, and then she was not, as if the ground had opened and swallowed her. The police began to see connections. 3 girls, 3 unsolved disappearances, all on Staten Island, all within the span of 11 years. The theory developed that a predator was operating on the island, someone who knew the neighborhoods well enough to identify opportunities, someone who could blend in sufficiently that his presence did not alarm potential witnesses, someone who had found a way to dispose of bodies so completely that not even fragments were discovered. Investigators looked at known sex offenders. They reviewed reports of suspicious behavior. They examined similar cases from other boroughs and nearby New Jersey. But the leads went nowhere. The person responsible, if indeed the same person was responsible for all 3 disappearances, left no evidence behind, no forensic traces, no pattern of behavior that allowed for prediction of when or where he might strike again. The only pattern was geography. Staten Island. Always Staten Island. The community responded as communities do when children vanish and are not found. Fear became routine, vigilance became exhausting. Parents struggled to balance keeping their children safe with allowing them the freedom necessary for normal development. Some families left Staten Island entirely, moving to places they believed were safer, though safety is always an illusion and predators operate everywhere. Those who remained adapted, creating informal networks of watchfulness, ensuring children traveled in groups, teaching them to be wary of any adult who approached them, even adults who seemed friendly or familiar. The legend of Cropsey gained new currency in these years. The disappearances gave the campfire tale a weight it had not possessed before. When parents warned their children about Cropsey now, the threat felt less abstract. Something was taking children. Whether it was a hook-handed madman living in the Willowbrook ruins, or simply a man who chose to hunt where legends provided cover, the result was the same. Children were gone, families were destroyed, and Staten Island, the forgotten borough at the edge of New York City, became known not for its suburban character or its ferry or its landfills, but for its missing children. Law enforcement officials were careful not to feed the legend, but they could not deny the reality that underlay it. Someone with knowledge of Staten Island, someone who had been present on the island for at least 11 years, someone who had access to places where bodies could be hidden effectively, was responsible for these crimes. The profile that emerged was of a predator who was patient, careful, and familiar with the terrain. The Willowbrook grounds, with their hundreds of acres of wooded hills and abandoned buildings, fit the profile of where such a person might operate. Police increased patrols around the ruins, but the property was too large to monitor effectively, and resources were limited. The summer of 1987 approached with these cases still unsolved. Alice, Holly Ann, and Tia Hees remained missing. Their families continued to hope against hope that somehow their daughters would be found alive, though as years passed that hope became more like ritual than belief, something practiced because the alternative was unbearable. Staten Island had learned to live with its missing children the way it learned to live with all its burdens, by carrying them quietly and trying not to think too much about what they meant. But July would bring an end to that uneasy equilibrium. Another child would disappear. This time the search would not end in frustration and fading headlines. This time there would be a discovery. And when that discovery came, when the body was found and the suspect arrested, Staten Island would learn that the legend of Cropsey had been obscuring a truth far more terrible and far more ordinary than any campfire story. The monster was not a ghost or a demon. The monster was a man, and he had been there all along, visible to anyone who looked, living in the ruins and waiting for opportunities that came with terrible regularity to someone patient enough to watch and wait. Chapter 5. Jennifer the Sea View. Campground occupied a triangle of wooded land on Staten Island's eastern shore, bordered by Forest Hill Road to the north and Brielle Avenue to the south. It was not wilderness in any true sense, but rather a managed clearing among oak and pine trees, where families could park recreational vehicles or pitch tents on the designated platforms. The sites were arranged in rough rows, separated by enough vegetation to provide the illusion of privacy, while remaining close enough that the sounds of neighbouring families carried easily through summer air. Bathhouses stood at intervals, painted concrete structures with showers and toilets. A small office near the entrance handled registrations and collected fees. During summer months, the campground filled with working-class families from the borough and the surrounding areas, people seeking respite from city heat without the expense of travelling to distant vacation destinations. The Schweiger family had come to Seaview in early July 1987. They were not newcomers to the campground. The family had spent previous summers there, establishing routines and forming friendships with other regular visitors. They occupied site number 63, where they had parked their camper and set up an outdoor area with chairs and a small table. The campground offered what they needed: for shade, other children for their daughter Jennifer to observe and be near, and a sense of being away from home without actually leaving Staten Island. Jennifer Schweiger was 12 years old that summer. She had been born with Down syndrome, and her cognitive development had progressed more slowly than typical children her age. She could not speak beyond a few simple words. Her communication with her family relied on gestures and expressions, and they had learned over the years to interpret her needs and wishes with reasonable accuracy. She was affectionate and trusting, the kind of child who smiled easily and sought physical closeness with her parents and siblings. She required supervision, but within the familiar boundaries of the campground, her family had found ways to allow her some freedom of movement while keeping her safe. The campground in July was busy but not crowded. Families established territories around their sites. Children roamed in loose packs from one area to another, and the days fell into patterns dictated by heat and meals and the simple activities that filled vacation time. Jennifer spent her days near the family camper, sometimes sitting in the shade, sometimes walking short distances to look at other campers, or to watch the squirrels that were abundant in the trees. Her parents kept watch, though the vigilance required for a 12-year-old with special needs was different from what would be needed for a younger child. Jennifer knew the campground. She knew where her family's site was located. She did not wander far, and when she did, she typically stayed within sight. July 9th, 1987 was a Thursday. The temperature climbed into the low 90s by afternoon, and humidity made the air feel heavier than it was. Most campers retreated to shade or to the bathhouses where fans provided some circulation. Jennifer's family was engaged in the ordinary activities of a summer day at a campground. Her father worked on minor repairs to the camper. Her mother prepared food. Her siblings came and went. Jennifer sat nearby for much of the afternoon, and then, at some point in the early evening, she was no longer there. The exact moment of her disappearance was not witnessed. Her family could not identify a specific time when Jennifer had been present and then was not. It was the nature of vacation supervision, the way attention drifted when surrounded by familiar people in a familiar place. Someone looked up and expected to see Jennifer where she had been sitting, and she was not there. They assumed she had walked to the bathhouse or to visit another family they knew. Minutes passed, then more minutes. Someone went to check the bathhouse. She was not there. Someone checked with the neighbours. No one had seen her. The minutes that had seemed unremarkable suddenly became urgent. Jennifer was missing. The family spread out through the campground calling her name, though she could not call back. They checked every site in their section, asking other campers if they had seen a 12-year-old girl with Down syndrome, describing what she was wearing. No one had seen her recently. They expanded the search, moving into sections of the campground farther from their site, checking the bathhouses again, looking in the small wooded areas between sites where a child might have wandered. Still nothing. The campground office was notified. The manager began organising other campers to help search, and someone called the police. The first officers arrived quickly. Seaview Campground was not remote. The nearest precinct was minutes away. The police understood immediately the nature of what they were dealing with. A 12-year-old girl with Down syndrome, non-verbal, trusting of adults, missing from a campground that bordered on woods and had multiple exit points to public roads. This was not a child who had wandered away and would find her way back. This was an abduction, or at least had to be treated as such until evidence suggested otherwise. Additional units were dispatched. Within an hour of the initial call, dozens of officers were on the scene. The campground was locked down, with no vehicles allowed to leave until they had been searched. Every campground visitor was questioned about what they had seen during the afternoon and evening. Descriptions of Jennifer were circulated. Her photograph, provided by her family, was copied and distributed to officers and volunteers. The search expanded beyond the campground into the surrounding woods and neighbourhoods. Helicopters were brought in to provide aerial surveillance. Search dogs arrived and were given items of Jennifer's clothing to establish her scent. The media responded quickly as well. By late evening, news crews had arrived at the campground. The story of a missing 12-year-old girl with special needs was exactly the kind of case that generated immediate coverage. Jennifer's parents gave brief statements to reporters, describing their daughter and pleading for anyone with information to come forward. The footage would air on late-night broadcasts and again in the morning, Jennifer's face appearing on television screens across the New York metropolitan area. The first night of searching continued past midnight. Flashlights moved through the woods surrounding the campground. Officers walked shoulder to shoulder through dense undergrowth, calling Jennifer's name even though they knew she could not respond. The search was as much about eliminating possibilities as finding the girl. If she had simply wandered into the woods and become lost or injured, they would find her quickly. The woods were not extensive, and a thorough search could cover the relevant area in hours. But as dawn approached and Jennifer had not been found, the likelihood that she remained in the immediate vicinity decreased. Someone had taken her. Someone had been at the campground or near it, had seen opportunity, and had acted. The investigation shifted to identifying potential suspects. Police interviewed everyone who had been at the campground on July 9th. They ran background checks looking for sex offenders or anyone with a history of crimes against children. They reviewed vehicles that had been seen in the area. They asked about strangers, about anyone who had seemed out of place or who had shown unusual interest in the children at the campground. The interviews produced descriptions of various individuals, but nothing that immediately suggested a suspect. The search continued through the following days with the intensity that always accompanies cases involving missing children. Volunteers from across Staten Island joined the effort. The woods surrounding the campground were searched repeatedly. Abandoned buildings in the area were checked. Waterways were dragged. Posters with Jennifer's photograph appeared on telephone poles and in store windows throughout the borough. The media coverage remained constant, with updates broadcast several times daily even when there was nothing new to report. Jennifer's family maintained vigil at the campground, unable to leave while their daughter was missing, hoping that somehow she would be found alive and unharmed. Friends and relatives came to support them. The campground community rallied, providing food and comfort and assistance with the practical matters that continued even in crisis. But as days passed without discovery, hope became harder to sustain. The searches grew more grim in their purpose. Investigators were no longer looking for a lost child who might be found alive. They were looking for a body. By the end of the first week, the case had been connected in the media to the earlier disappearances of Alice Pereira, Holly Ann Hughes, and Tia Hees Jackson. Reporters noted the similarities. All were girls, all from Staten Island, all vanished without witnesses to the actual abduction. The theory of a serial predator operating on the island was discussed openly now. Psychologists were interviewed about the profile of someone who targeted children. Former FBI agents provided commentary on investigative techniques. The coverage fed the fear that had been building on Staten Island for years. Parents who had tried to maintain normalcy for their children now faced the reality that the danger was not theoretical. It was active, it was present, and it had taken another child. The police continued to follow leads, but the investigation was hampered by the same problems that had plagued the earlier cases. No witnesses, no physical evidence, no clear suspect. The campground had been busy on July 9th, with dozens of people present, yet no one had seen Jennifer leave or seen anyone taking her. She had simply vanished in the space of minutes from a place where she should have been safe because she was surrounded by people. 12 days after Jennifer disappeared, on July 21st, the search reached the grounds of the former Willowbrook State School. The abandoned institution sat less than 2 miles from the Seaview campground, connected by woods and roads that could be walked in under an hour. The property had been searched earlier in the investigation, but not thoroughly. The grounds were too extensive and the buildings too numerous for a quick sweep to be effective. Now, with time passing and other search areas exhausted, investigators committed resources to a systematic examination of the Willowbrook site. The search teams moved through the overgrown grounds in the heat of late July. They checked buildings that had been chained shut and found some with chains broken or removed. They found evidence of recent habitation in several structures. Sleeping areas made from old mattresses and blankets, food wrappers, empty bottles, drug paraphernalia. The abandoned institution had become a refuge for the homeless and the desperate, people who had nowhere else to go and found shelter in the ruins. Officers documented what they found and continued searching. In the late afternoon of July 21st, officers searching a wooded area near one of the buildings found disturbed earth. The ground had been dug up recently, then covered again with soil and debris. The area was marked and excavation began carefully. Within minutes, they had uncovered what they had been dreading to find. Jennifer Schweiger's body lay in a shallow grave, buried hastily beneath branches and dirt. She was still wearing the clothes she had disappeared in 12 days earlier. The search was over. The investigation had entered its next phase. The news reached Jennifer's family before it reached the media, but not by much. Within hours, the discovery was being reported on every television and radio station in the region. The coverage was relentless and graphic in its implications, if not its details. A child with special needs had been abducted from a campground and murdered, her body hidden on the grounds of an institution that had already become synonymous with the abuse and neglect of vulnerable people. The symbolism was almost too heavy to bear. Willowbrook, which had failed so many children during its years of operation, had now become the burial ground for one more. But the discovery of Jennifer's body provided what the earlier cases had not, a location, and locations contain clues. The police had found evidence of someone living in the buildings near where Jennifer was buried. They had found items that suggested regular habitation, not just occasional trespassing. Someone knew these grounds well. Someone had been living here long enough to be comfortable, to feel safe from discovery. And when Jennifer was taken, that person had brought her here because this was familiar territory, a place where burial could happen without witnesses. The investigation focused now on identifying who had been using the buildings as shelter. The evidence collected from the makeshift living areas was catalogued. Fingerprints were lifted. Descriptions were sought from anyone who had seen suspicious individuals near Willowbrook in recent weeks, and one name kept appearing in the interviews. One description that matched what officers had found. A man with long hair and a beard. A man who had lived in the buildings for years. A man who had once worked at Willowbrook when it was still operating. A man named Andre Rand. Chapter 6. The Discovery. The arrest came on July 22nd, 1987. Less than 24 hours after Jennifer Schweiger's body had been found. The speed was unusual in cases where evidence was primarily circumstantial, but the circumstances demanded action. A child had been murdered. Her body had been discovered on grounds where a specific individual was known to be living. The police had probable cause, and there they moved quickly before the suspect could disappear. Andre Rand was not difficult to find. He had not fled after Jennifer's disappearance, had not changed his patterns or attempted to hide. When officers arrived at the Willowbrook grounds on the morning of July 2nd, they found him in one of the abandoned buildings he had been using as shelter. He was 53 years old, thin and weathered, with long grey hair and a beard that made him look older than his years. His clothing was dirty and worn. He possessed few belongings beyond what he was wearing and what was scattered in the building where he slept. He did not resist arrest. He did not ask why he was being taken. He simply went with the officers, silent and compliant, as if he had been expecting this moment. The media was present when Rand was brought out of the building in handcuffs. News crews had been monitoring police activity at Willowbrook since Jennifer's body was discovered, and they captured footage of a dishevelled man being led to a police vehicle. The images were broadcast repeatedly over the following days. This was the man accused of killing Jennifer Schweiger. This was the man who had been living in the ruins of Willowbrook, sleeping in the same buildings where thousands of disabled children had once been warehoused. This was the man who some were already suggesting might be responsible for the other disappearances that had haunted Staten Island for 15 years. The initial interrogation produced little of value. Rand declined to speak to investigators without an attorney present. When an attorney was provided, Rand continued to say very little. He denied involvement in Jennifer's disappearance and death. He acknowledged living on the Willowbrook grounds, but claimed he had not been present on July 9th, that he had been elsewhere on Staten Island that day. He could not provide witnesses to support this alibi. He could not explain why Jennifer's body had been found so close to where he had been living. He simply repeated that he had not taken the girl, had not harmed her, knew nothing about what had happened. The physical evidence collected from Willowbrook was processed urgently. Fingerprints found in the building where Rand had been living were compared to prints taken from him after his arrest. They matched, confirming what was already known. Rand had been using the building as shelter, but fingerprints in a building where someone lived proved nothing about involvement in a murder that had occurred nearby. The soil on Rand's clothing and shoes was compared to soil from the gravesite. There were similarities, but soil evidence was notoriously unreliable for establishing specific locations. The clothing Rand was wearing when arrested was examined for traces of Jennifer's DNA or fibres from her clothes. None were found, but 12 days had passed since her disappearance, time enough to dispose of or clean any clothing that might have been worn during the crime. The prosecution would have to build its case on circumstantial evidence and witness testimony. They had no confession. They had no physical evidence directly linking Rand to the crime. They had no witnesses who had seen him with Jennifer on July 9th. What they had was proximity and opportunity, and a defendant whose life circumstances made him easy to cast as a predator. Andre Rand was homeless, living in abandoned buildings, disconnected from society in ways that made him seem dangerous regardless of what he had actually done. He fit the profile that had been circulating for years. The phantom predator who knew Staten Island and had access to places where bodies could be hidden. He had become, in the eyes of investigators and the public, the living embodiment of the Cropsey legend. The investigation into Rand's background began immediately. Detectives traced his life back through decades, looking for patterns that might connect him to the earlier disappearances or to other crimes. What they found was a man whose existence had been marginal and troubled, but not obviously violent until now. He had been born Frank Roshan in 1944, one of several children in a working-class family. The name change to Andre Rand had come in the 1960s, though the reasons were unclear and Rand himself would not explain them. He had worked various jobs through his 20s and 30s, never holding positions for long, drifting between employment and unemployment in ways that suggested instability but not criminality. His connection to Willowbrook had begun in the 1960s, when he was hired as a custodian. He worked at the institution during some of its worst years, the period before the 1972 expose when overcrowding and understaffing had created conditions that would later be condemned as inhumane. As a custodian, Rand would have had access to all areas of the institution. He would have known the layout of the buildings, the location of the tunnels, the places where staff rarely went. He would have been present when the children were being abused and neglected, though whether he participated in or witnessed such abuse was unknown. His employment at Willowbrook ended in the early 1970s, around the time the scandal broke and reforms began. He had been let go, along with many other staff members, as part of the downsizing that accompanied the consent decree mandating changes. After leaving Willowbrook, Rand's life became increasingly unstable. He held no steady employment, he had no permanent address, he drifted around Staten Island, staying with the relatives when they would have him, sleeping rough when they would not. Sometime in the late 70s or early 1980s, he returned to Willowbrook and began living in the abandoned buildings. By then the institution was mostly closed, with only a small section still operating. The rest of the property sat empty and unguarded. For a man with nowhere else to go, the buildings offered shelter that was free and familiar. Rand settled in, making himself at home in the ruins, and apparently felt secure enough to remain for years. His presence on the grounds had not gone unnoticed. Security guards who still patrolled the operational section of Willowbrook occasionally encountered him and chased him off, but he always returned. Local teenagers who explored the abandoned buildings sometimes saw him, and their descriptions fed into the Cropsey legend. Police had been called numerous times to reports of a homeless man living in the buildings, but no arrests had resulted. Trespassing in an abandoned institution was low priority for law enforcement, and Rand had never been caught doing anything more serious. He was a nuisance, not a threat. Or so it had seemed. Now investigators looked at the years Rand had spent living at Willowbrook and wondered what else he might have done during that time. The disappearances of Alice Pereira in 1972, Holly Ann Hughes in 1981, and Tierhys Jackson in 1983 had all occurred while Rand was living on or near Staten Island. Had he been living at Willowbrook during those years, or had he only taken up residence there later? Witnesses gave conflicting accounts. Some believed they had seen him at the grounds as early as the mid-1970s. Others thought he had only appeared there in the 80s. The timeline was unclear, and Rand refused to clarify it. Detectives began interviewing people who might have seen Rand with the missing girls. They showed his photograph to residents of the neighborhoods where the abductions had occurred. Some witnesses came forward claiming they remembered seeing a man matching Rand's description in the areas around the time the girls disappeared. One witness claimed to have seen Rand talking to Holly Ann Hughes days before she vanished. Another claimed to have seen him near the apartment complex where Holly Ann was taken. These accounts were years old and memory is unreliable even in the best circumstances, but the statements were documented and would later be used in court. The prosecution began to construct a narrative that connected Rand to all four cases. He was a drifter with a history of working at an institution where children were abused. He lived on the grounds where Jennifer's body was found. Witnesses placed him near the locations where other girls had disappeared. He fit the profile of a paedophile and predator. The case was circumstantial, but some circumstantial cases could be won if the circumstances were compelling enough and the defendant was unsympathetic enough. Andre Rand was profoundly unsympathetic. His appearance, his lifestyle, his silence all worked against him. He looked like a monster. Therefore, the prosecution would argue he was a monster. The defense faced enormous challenges. Their client refused to cooperate fully, would not explain his movements on July 9th, could not or would not provide alibis for the dates when the other girls had disappeared. He had no one who would speak on his behalf, no family members or friends willing to testify to his character. His years at Willowbrook made him suspect even if he had never harmed anyone there. His decision to live in the abandoned building suggested something was wrong with him, some fundamental inability to function in normal society that made people uncomfortable regardless of whether it indicated criminal behavior. The attorney assigned to represent Rand argued that his client was being prosecuted not for evidence of guilt but for being an easy target. Rand was homeless and strange, and when a child was found dead near where he lived, he became the obvious suspect. But proximity was not proof. Living on the same property where a body was buried did not mean he had put it there. The prosecution had no physical evidence, no witnesses to the crime, no confession. They had only circumstances and a defendant who looked guilty because he was different. The preliminary hearings in the months following Rand's arrest received extensive media coverage. Every detail of his life was examined and reported. His name became synonymous with the Cropsey legend. News stories referred to him as the alleged Cropsey killer, connecting the campfire tale directly to the man in custody. The legend that had been abstract for generations now had a face, and that face appeared on television screens and newspaper front pages day after day. Parents pointed to his photograph and told their children this was why they must be careful, why they must never talk to strangers, why the warnings had been real all along. Public opinion solidified quickly against Rand. He was guilty in the court of public sentiment long before his trial began. The details of his life, revealed piece by piece through media coverage, confirmed every stereotype about predators who targeted children. He was isolated, unemployed, living on the margins of society in ways that seemed incomprehensible to people with stable homes and families. He was the other, the outsider, the figure who did not belong in communities of normal people. And when children went missing from those communities, of course the outsider was responsible. The logic was circular and prejudiced, but it was powerful. The trial for Mao. Jennifer Schweiger's murder was scheduled for the following year. The prosecution would seek conviction for kidnapping and murder. If successful, they planned to pursue charges in the other cases as well, using the conviction in Jennifer's death to establish pattern and motive. The defense would argue reasonable doubt, would point to the lack of physical evidence, would try to separate their client from the legend that had already convicted him in the public mind. The outcome would depend on whether the jury could distinguish between evidence and assumption, between proof and prejudice. But even before the trial began, even before witnesses took the stand and lawyers made their arguments, the essential narrative had been established. Andre Rand had been living in the ruins of Willowbrook when Jennifer Schweiger disappeared. Her body had been found near where he lived. Therefore, he had killed her. The simplicity of this logic was appealing. It resolved the case quickly. It gave Jennifer's family someone to blame. It gave Staten Island a monster to focus its fear and anger upon. And it confirmed what the legend of Cropsey had always promised, that the danger was real, that the abandoned building sheltered evil, that the warnings parents had given their children were not just stories but prophecies now fulfilled. The island that had lived with missing children for 15 years finally had answers. Whether those answers were true or simply convenient would be decided in court. But the damage was done. Andre Rand would never be anything but the Cropsey killer, regardless of verdict, regardless of evidence. The legend had claimed him, and legends, once established, are almost impossible to undo. Chapter 7. The Drifter in the Ruins. Frank Russian was born in March 1944 in the final months of the Second World War, delivered in a hospital on the outskirts of New York City to parents whose circumstances were modest and whose prospects were limited by the economic realities of the time. He was not the first child in the family and would not be the last. His early years were spent in neighborhoods where poverty was common and opportunity was rare. The details of his childhood remain sparse in the historical record, reconstructed later from fragments of testimony and public documents that focused more on outcomes than origins. What is known suggests an upbringing that was unremarkable in its difficulties, typical of working-class families in post-war urban America. The schools he attended were overcrowded institutions where children who struggled received little individual attention. Frank was not a particularly successful student. His academic performance was mediocre, his attendance irregular. He reached adolescence without distinguishing himself in any meaningful way, without developing skills that might lead to stable employment or advancement. When he left school, it was not because he had completed his education, but because he had aged out of the system without achieving what the system measured as success. His teenage years and early 20s passed in a blur of short-term jobs and extended periods of unemployment. He worked as a labourer when work was available. He helped family members with tasks that required physical effort but no particular expertise. He drifted between addresses, staying with relatives until his presence became burdensome, then moving on to other temporary arrangements. By his mid-20s, the pattern of instability was well established. He could not maintain employment. He could not sustain relationships. He moved through the world without leaving much impression on it, a figure at the margins whose existence was noted primarily when it caused inconvenience. Sometime in the 60s, Frank Rushan became Andre Rand. The name change was legal, processed through the courts, but the motivation behind it was never clearly explained. He offered no coherent reason when asked about it years later. Some who knew him suggested he had wanted to distance himself from his family, or from failures associated with his birth name. Others speculated the change was an attempt to reinvent himself, to become someone different from who he had been. But reinvention requires more than a new name, and Andre Rand proved to be much the same person as Frank Rushan had been, only with different identification documents. The name change preceded his employment at Willowbrook State School by only a short time. Rand was hired in the late 1960s as a custodian, one of many low-level staff members brought in during the years when the institution was expanding rapidly and desperately needed workers. The job required no specialized training or education. The duties were simple: cleaning floors, emptying trash, maintaining basic order in buildings that housed thousands of residents and could descend into chaos without constant attention. The pay was low but steady, and for someone like Rand, who had struggled to hold any job for long, the position at Willowbrook represented a kind of stability. He worked at the institution during its darkest period, the years before the scandal broke publicly, when overcrowding had reached its peak and the conditions for residents were at their worst. As a custodian, Rand moved through all areas of Willowbrook. He cleaned the day rooms where children sat in their own waste. He mopped the dormitories where residents slept pressed together in beds that were never quite clean. He emptied the trash from offices where administrators filed reports noting deficiencies but never implementing changes. He saw everything. The question that would be asked later, the question that could never be satisfactorily answered, was what he thought about what he saw. Did he recognize the horror of Willowbrook, or did he simply accept it as normal because he had no other frame of reference for how such institutions should operate? Did he feel sympathy for the residents, or did he view them as less than human in the way that institutions encourage staff to view them? Did he participate in the abuse that was endemic to the place, or did he merely witness it and say nothing? The answers mattered legally when he was later accused of crimes, and they mattered morally for understanding what kind of person he was. But Rand never provided answers. His silence on the subject was absolute. His employment at Willowbrook ended in the early 70s when the scandal forced the institution to downsize. Staff were let go by the hundreds as the state began implementing the reforms mandated by federal oversight. Rand was among those released, not for cause, but simply because his position was eliminated in the reorganization. He received no severance beyond what was legally required. He had no other job waiting, and so he returned to the pattern that had characterized his life before Willowbrook, drifting, unemployed, moving between temporary living arrangements that never lasted. The 70s were years of increasing marginalization for Rand. He worked occasionally at jobs that paid by the day, and required no commitment beyond showing up. He stayed with family members until they tired of supporting him. He slept in cars, in shelters when he could access them, in abandoned buildings when no other option existed. His appearance began to deteriorate. The conventions of grooming fell away. His hair grew long and unkempt. His beard, which he had worn trimmed during his years at Willowbrook, became wild and grey. His clothing grew ragged. He looked like what he was, a man without resources, living at the absolute margins of society. Sometime in the late 1970s, or early 80s, Rand returned to Willowbrook. The institution was mostly closed by then, the residents relocated, the buildings abandoned except for a small operational section that still housed a few dozen people while the state determined what to do with the property. The grounds were not secured. The buildings, though locked, could be entered by anyone willing to break a chain or force a door. And Rand was willing. He found his way into buildings he had once cleaned as an employee, and he made them his home. The choice was logical in its way. The buildings offered shelter from weather. They were familiar to him. He knew the layout, knew where water might still flow from pipes, knew which sections were least likely to be inspected by the occasional security patrol. The ruins of Willowbrook became his domain, and he lived there with the confidence of someone who had nowhere else to be and nothing to lose by staying. Other homeless individuals also used the buildings from time to time, but they rarely stayed long. The isolation bothered them, or the condition of the buildings proved too unpleasant even for people with few other options. But Rand remained. He established a routine that revolved around basic survival. He collected cans and bottles for redemption, earning enough money for minimal food. He scavenged what he needed from dumpsters and donation bins. He avoided authorities when possible, and moved between buildings when necessary to stay ahead of the rare security patrols that might chase him off. His presence on the grounds was known to many but concerning to few. Security guards who encountered him filed reports noting a trespasser, but no arrests followed. Police who were called occasionally to the property found no one when they arrived, or found Rand and ordered him to leave without taking him into custody. The violations were minor, and the resources required to keep Rand off the property permanently exceeded what anyone was willing to dedicate to the problem. So he stayed, year after year, becoming a fixture of the ruins as much as the buildings themselves. Teenagers who explored Willowbrook sometimes saw him. They described a wild-looking man with long grey hair who appeared suddenly in doorways or corridors, watching them until they fled. These sightings became part of the Cropsey legend, though the teenagers did not know the man's name or background. He was simply the figure in the abandoned buildings, the one who proved the legend was real, and groups of teenagers made it a dare to approach him, to get close enough to see him clearly before running. Others avoided any building where he might be, preferring to explore sections of the grounds where he was less likely to appear. Rand's interaction with others was minimal. He spoke rarely, and when he did, his comments were brief and often incoherent. He seemed uncomfortable with human contact, preferring solitude in the ruins to company among people. He had no friends, no regular associates, no one who checked on his well-being or knew where he was on any given day. His isolation was nearly complete. He existed in a space between society and invisibility, noticed when his presence created problems, but otherwise ignored. The years passed this way through the first half of the 1980s. Rand lived in the ruins, children disappeared from Staten Island, and no one connected the drifter in the abandoned buildings to the cases that were baffling investigators. He was too obvious, too visible in his strangeness. The assumption was that whoever was taking children must be someone who could blend into society, someone who did not attract attention. A homeless man living in ruins was too conspicuous to be a predator, or so the reasoning went. But visibility and invisibility are not opposites when the visible are treated as if they do not matter. Rand was seen constantly by those who explored Willowbrook or passed by the grounds, but being seen is not the same as being noticed, and being noticed is not the same as being investigated. He was dismissed as a harmless vagrant, a man whose mental state was clearly compromised, but who posed no danger beyond his presence in buildings where he did not belong. The idea that this shambling, unkempt figure could be responsible for sophisticated abductions and successful concealment of bodies seemed improbable to those who encountered him. And so he remained at Willowbrook, living in buildings that had once housed thousands of the city's most vulnerable citizens, sleeping in rooms where children had suffered and died from neglect. He walked the same corridors he had mopped as an employee. He looked out the same windows where residents had once pressed their faces, desperate for any view of a world they could not access. The buildings were his prison and his refuge, and he showed no inclination to leave them. When Jennifer Schweiger disappeared in July 1987 and her body was found on the Willowbrook grounds 12 days later, the investigation finally turned its attention to the man who had been there all along. Rand's invisibility ended. His years of drifting through the ruins without consequence came to an abrupt conclusion. And everything about his life, every choice and circumstance that had led him to that place at that time, would be examined and interpreted in light of what had happened. The drifter in the ruins became the suspect. The figure from the legend became the defendant. And Andre Rand, who had spent decades at the margins of society without anyone particularly caring what he did or where he went, suddenly found himself at the centre of attention he had never sought and could not escape. Chapter 8. The Other Children. Alice Pereira would have been 20 years old in 1987 when Jennifer Schweiger's body was discovered at Willowbrook. She would have been old enough to vote, to work, to build a life of her own choosing. But Alice had not reached 20. She had not reached 6. She remained forever 5 years old, frozen in the photographs her family kept and in the memory of an August afternoon in 1972 when she left her apartment building to buy groceries and never returned. For 15 years, her case had remained open, investigated periodically when new leads emerged, but never solved. Now, with Andre Rand in custody and investigators looking into his background, Alice's disappearance received renewed attention. The distance between Alice's neighbourhood in Port Richmond and the Willowbrook grounds was substantial, several miles across Staten Island. In V72, Rand may or may not have been living at Willowbrook. The timeline of when he began residing in the abandoned buildings was unclear, contested by witnesses whose memories of decades past were unreliable. But investigators knew Rand had been on Staten Island in 1972. He had been working at Willowbrook when the institution was still operating. Before the scandal broke and before his employment ended, he would have had familiarity with the borough, knowledge of neighbourhoods and roads, the kind of local understanding that a predator would need to identify opportunities and avoid detection. Detectives re-interviewed witnesses from the original investigation into Alice's disappearance. They showed photographs of Rand to people who lived in Port Richmond in 1972, asking if anyone remembered seeing him in the area. The responses were mixed and inconclusive. Some witnesses thought they might have seen someone matching his description, but 15 years had passed and memory degrades across such spans. Others were certain they had never seen him. The neighbourhood in 72 had been populated by hundreds of people, and isolating one individual from that mass of humanity without specific markers was nearly impossible. The original investigation had never identified a strong suspect. Alice had been abducted in daylight from a residential street, yet no witnesses had come forward with descriptions of suspicious vehicles or individuals. The conclusion had been that someone familiar with the neighbourhood had taken her, someone who did not stand out as foreign or threatening. Rand in 1872 would have been in his late 20s, younger than he was now, but already showing signs of the instability that would define his later years. Whether he would have blended into a working-class neighbourhood or stood out as suspicious was unknown. The lack of physical evidence in Alice's case made connecting it to Rand extraordinarily difficult. Her body had never been found. No crime scene existed to process for fingerprints or DNA. The only evidence was the absence itself, the fact that a 5-year-old girl had vanished and remained vanished. If Rand was responsible, where had he hidden her? If he had been living at Willowbrook in 72, the institution's grounds would have offered numerous locations where a body could be hidden. But searches of the property conducted after Jennifer's discovery had not turned up additional remains. Either Alice was buried elsewhere, or she was buried in a location that had not yet been searched, or Rand was not responsible for her disappearance. Holly Ann Hughes presented a more compelling connection. She had disappeared in October 1981 from an apartment complex on Staten Island's eastern shore, close to the Willowbrook grounds. By 1981, most witnesses agreed Rand was living in the abandoned buildings. He would have been familiar with the neighbourhood surrounding the property because he would have travelled through them regularly while scavenging for food and supplies. The apartment complex where Holly Ann was taken was within walking distance of Willowbrook, close enough that someone living at the institution could have reached it easily and returned without needing transportation. Investigators located a witness who claimed to have seen Rand in the apartment complex days before Holly Ann disappeared. The witness was a resident who had noticed a strange man with long hair and a beard hanging around the courtyard where children played. The description matched Rand's appearance in 1981. The witness had not reported the sighting at the time because the man had not done anything overtly threatening. He had simply been present, watching the children, and then he had left. But the memory had stayed with the witness, and when shown Rand's photograph in 1987, the witness identified him as the man from the courtyard. Another witness came forward with an even more specific claim. This person stated they had seen Rand talking to Holly Ann Hughes on the day she disappeared, had watched him engage the little girl in conversation near the apartments. The witness had not intervened because the interaction had seemed innocent, just an adult speaking briefly to a child. But later, when Holly Ann was reported missing, the witness had wondered if the man they saw had been involved. They had not come forward in 1981 because they could not provide a detailed description and had assumed police would not find the information useful. Now, 6 years later, when shown Rand's photograph, they claimed certainty that he was the man they had seen with Holly Ann. The defence would later challenge both witnesses vigorously. 6 years had passed between the alleged sightings and the identifications. Human memory is notoriously unreliable across such spans, especially when the witness has been exposed to photographs and media coverage that might influence their recollection. The witnesses might genuinely believe they had seen Rand, but belief and accuracy are not synonymous. The mind constructs memories from fragments and fills gaps with information acquired later, creating false certainty about events that never occurred or occurred differently than remembered. But the prosecution would argue that despite the time lag, the witnesses were credible. They had no reason to lie. They had come forward voluntarily when they learned a suspect was in custody. Their descriptions of Rand matched his appearance in 1981 before they saw his photograph. The fact that multiple witnesses placed him near the location where Holly Ann disappeared was significant even if each individual account had weaknesses. Together, the accounts created a pattern that was difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Holly Ann's body, like Alice's, had never been recovered. Searches of the Willowbrook grounds after her disappearance had been limited, and the property offered countless locations where remains could be hidden. The woods surrounding the buildings were dense and extensive. The buildings themselves had basements and crawl spaces that were rarely if ever inspected. The tunnels beneath the institution ran for miles and included sections that were partially collapsed or flooded. A determined individual could conceal a body in any of these locations with reasonable confidence it would not be found without an intensive search that covered every possible area. Tia Hees Jackson's case presented similar evidentiary challenges. He had disappeared in August 1983 from a bus stop in the Mariners Harbour neighbourhood, which was farther from Willowbrook than Holly Ann's apartment complex but still within Staten Island. The same questions applied. Could Rand have travelled to that neighbourhood? Would he have had opportunity to encounter Tia Hees? Were there witnesses who had seen him in the area? The investigation into Tia Hees' disappearance had produced almost no leads in 1983. She had been waiting for a bus in broad daylight when she vanished. No one had seen her get into a vehicle or walk away with anyone. The assumption had been that she was taken quickly by someone who understood how to exploit a brief window of opportunity. Rand, living at Willowbrook and regularly travelling across Staten Island on foot or by using public transportation, would have had the mobility to reach Mariners Harbour. Whether he had actually been there on the day Tia Hees disappeared was unknown. No witnesses came forward placing Rand near the bus stop in August 1983. No physical evidence connected him to the case, and the link was purely circumstantial and geographic. Tia Hees had disappeared from Staten Island. Rand lived on Staten Island, therefore investigators reasoned he should be considered a suspect. The logic was weak, but not entirely without merit. Serial predators often operate within defined geographic areas where they feel comfortable and knowledgeable. If Rand was responsible for Holly Ann's disappearance, it was plausible he was responsible for Tia Hees's as well. The cases shared characteristics: young girls abducted from public places in daylight, bodies never recovered. The question of motive and method arose repeatedly during the investigation. If Rand was responsible for multiple disappearances, what was driving him? Interviews with psychologists and former FBI profilers suggested he might fit the pattern of a preferential child offender, someone whose sexual attraction was directed primarily or exclusively toward children. Such offenders often have histories of working in positions that give them access to children, as Rand had at Willowbrook. They often lead isolated lives and struggle with adult relationships, as Rand clearly did. They often operate within geographic areas where they can identify potential victims through observation and where they have knowledge of locations suitable for disposing of bodies. But the profile was generic enough to fit many individuals, and fitting a profile is not evidence of guilt. The prosecution would need more than psychological theory to connect Rand to the earlier disappearances. They would need witnesses, physical evidence, or a confession. The witnesses who had come forward regarding Holly Ann's case were helpful, but not conclusive. Physical evidence did not exist in cases where bodies had not been found, and Rand showed no inclination to confess to anything. The families of the missing girls watched the developments with conflicting emotions. They wanted answers. They wanted to know what had happened to their daughters. If Andre Rand was responsible, they wanted him held accountable, but they also understood that without bodies, without definitive proof, the questions might never be fully answered. Even if Rand was convicted in Jennifer's case, even if he was charged in the earlier disappearances, the lack of physical evidence meant some doubt would always remain. The girls would still be missing. The grief would still be unresolved. Alice's parents had spent 15 years hoping their daughter might somehow still be alive, that she had been taken but not killed, that she might be returned to them. The hope was irrational after so many years, but hope persists beyond rationality when the alternative is accepting that a child is dead without proof. Now, with Rand's arrest, that hope faced its final test. If he was responsible for Alice's disappearance, she was almost certainly dead. Her body was somewhere, buried or hidden, waiting to be discovered if the right location was searched. Or perhaps she would never be found, would remain missing forever, and her parents would die without ever knowing exactly what had happened to their daughter. Holly Ann's mother had never stopped searching. She had distributed flyers for years after her daughter's disappearance. She had contacted psychics and investigators and anyone who claimed to have information. She had followed every lead, no matter how unlikely, driven by the need to do something rather than simply wait. When she learned that a man was in custody and that witnesses had placed him near her daughter on the day she disappeared, the relief was tempered by caution. She had been disappointed before by suspects who proved uninvolved. She would not allow herself to believe this time was different until there was certainty. Tia Hyaz's family had fewer resources and less media attention. Their daughter's disappearance had received coverage, but not as extensive as Holly Ann's or Jennifer's. They were poorer, less connected, less able to generate the kind of public pressure that sometimes forces investigators to maintain focus on cases that might otherwise be deprioritized. They learned about Rand's arrest from news reports, not from personal notification by police. They called the precinct and asked if their daughter's case was being reviewed in light of the new suspect. They were told it was, but details were scarce. They waited, as they had been waiting for 4 years, for answers that might never come. The investigation expanded to include other missing children cases from Staten Island and neighbouring areas. Detectives looked for patterns that might indicate additional victims. They examined unsolved disappearances going back to the 1960s, searching for cases that matched the profile. Young girls taken from public places, bodies never recovered. Several cases warranted closer examination, but definitive connections to Rand could not be established. The problem with cold cases is that evidence degrades over time. Witnesses die or move away or forget. Physical evidence is lost or destroyed. The trail grows cold until nothing remains. But question. Andre Rand sat in custody and said nothing. He did not deny involvement in the earlier cases, but neither did he confirm it. He simply refused to engage with questions about Alice, Holly Ann, or Tia Hyaz. His attorney advised him to remain silent, and he followed that advice absolutely. Whatever he knew about the missing girls, whatever involvement he may or may not have had, stayed locked behind his silence. And that thesis, that refusal to provide answers that families desperately needed, became its own kind of cruelty, separate from whatever crimes he had committed. The other children remained missing. Their names were spoken less frequently as years passed, but never forgotten by those who loved them. They became statistics in databases of unsolved cases, photographs in files that sat in precinct storage rooms, memories carried by parents and siblings who aged, while the missing girls remained forever young. And when Andre Rand was finally brought to trial, when the evidence was presented, and the witnesses testified and the verdicts were delivered, the other children would still be missing, their cases still open, their families still waiting for closure that might never arrive. Chapter 9. The Trials. The trial for the kidnapping of Jennifer Schweiger began in April 1988, 9 months after her body had been discovered on the grounds of Willowbrook State School. The prosecution had chosen to charge Andre Rand with kidnapping rather than murder, a strategic decision based on the strength of the available evidence. Proving kidnapping required demonstrating that Rand had taken Jennifer and moved her from one location to another against her will. Proving murder required establishing cause of death, and the condition of Jennifer's body after 12 days in a shallow grave had made that determination difficult. The medical examiner could not definitively state how she had died. There were no obvious signs of trauma, no bullets or stab wounds, no clear evidence of strangulation or suffocation. She might have been smothered or drugged or frightened to death. The uncertainty made a murder charge risky, but kidnapping could be proven through circumstantial evidence and witness testimony. The trial took place in Staten Island Supreme Court before Justice William T. Sheedy. The courtroom filled each day with reporters, family members, and members of the public who had followed the case through media coverage and wanted to witness the proceedings firsthand. The atmosphere was tense and emotional. Jennifer's parents attended daily, sitting in the front rows where Rand could see them, their presence a silent accusation. Rand himself appeared in court wearing clothes provided by the jail, his long hair and beard now trimmed slightly, but still giving him the unkempt appearance that had characterized his years living at Willowbrook. He sat beside his attorney, rarely speaking, his expression unreadable. The prosecution's opening statement outlined the case they intended to prove. Jennifer Schweiger had disappeared from the Seaview campground on July 9, 1987. Her body had been found on July 21st on the Willowbrook grounds where Andre Rand had been living for years. The proximity was not coincidental. Rand had taken Jennifer from the campground, brought her to Willowbrook and buried her body there when she died. The prosecution would present witnesses who had seen Rand near the campground on the day Jennifer disappeared. They would present evidence of his presence at Willowbrook. They would demonstrate that Rand had the opportunity, the means, and the motive to commit the crime. The defense's opening statement challenged every element of the prosecution's narrative. Proximity was not proof. Living near where a body was found did not mean Rand had put it there. The prosecution had no physical evidence linking Rand to Jennifer. No forensic traces, no DNA, no fingerprints on her clothing or body. No witnesses who had actually seen him with Jennifer. The case was built entirely on circumstantial evidence and speculation. The prosecution would try to convince the jury that because Rand was homeless and strange, he must be guilty. But guilt required proof beyond reasonable doubt, and the prosecution had not met that burden. The first witnesses called by the prosecution were Jennifer's family members. They testified about the day she disappeared, describing the timeline of events and the moment they realized she was missing. Their testimony established the facts of the kidnapping but did not connect those facts to Rand. The emotional weight of their testimony was significant, reminding the jury that this was not an abstract legal exercise, but a case about a real child who had been taken from people who loved her. The prosecution then called witnesses who placed Rand near the Seaview campground on July 9th. A campground employee testified that he had seen a man matching Rand's description walking on the road near the campground entrance that afternoon. The witness could not be certain it was Rand, but the description of long hair, beard, and shabby clothing matched. Another witness, a camper, testified to seeing a similar figure in the woods bordering the campground. Again, the identification was not certain, but the description was consistent with Rand's appearance. The defense cross-examined these witnesses aggressively. They challenged the reliability of the identifications. The witnesses had not known Rand at the time they allegedly saw him. They were identifying him months after the fact, after extensive media coverage had shown his photograph repeatedly. Could they truly be certain the man they saw was Rand? Or had they convinced themselves of that certainty after learning he was a suspect? The witnesses maintained they were certain, but the defense had introduced doubt. The prosecution called officers who had searched the Willowbrook grounds and discovered Jennifer's body. They testified about the location of the grave, which was near buildings where evidence of Rand's habitation had been found. They described the items recovered from those buildings, bedding, clothing, food wrappers, all suggesting someone had been living there for an extended period. Fingerprints found in the buildings matched Rand's. The connection between Rand and the location was firmly established. The medical examiner testified about Jennifer's body and the difficulty of determining cause of death. She'd been dead for approximately 12 days when found. Decomposition and environmental factors had complicated the examination. There was no obvious trauma. Toxicology tests had been inconclusive because of the body's condition. The examiner could not rule out natural causes, though the circumstances of Jennifer being buried in a shallow grave made natural death unlikely. The prosecution used the uncertainty to argue that cause of death did not matter for the kidnapping charge. What mattered was that Jennifer had been taken and moved to Willowbrook, where she died and was buried. The defense called few witnesses. Their strategy focused on attacking the prosecution's case rather than presenting an alternative narrative. Rand did not testify. His attorney advised him that taking the stand would expose him to cross-examination that would likely be damaging, given his inability or unwillingness to provide a clear account of his movements on July 9th. The decision not to testify could not legally be used against him, but juries notice when defendants remain silent, and silence can be interpreted as having something to hide. The closing arguments summarized the competing narratives. The prosecution argued that the cumulative weight of circumstantial evidence pointed conclusively to Rand's guilt. He had been near the campground when Jennifer disappeared. He lived where her body was found. He had no alibi. He fit the profile of someone who would commit such a crime. The evidence might be circumstantial, but circumstantial evidence could be more reliable than direct evidence, especially when multiple circumstances all pointed in the same direction. The defense argued that the prosecution had failed to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Circumstantial evidence was only as strong as the circumstances, and these circumstances were weak. Being near a location was not a crime. Living where a body was later found was not proof of murder or kidnapping. The prosecution had built a case on assumptions and prejudice, assuming Rand was guilty because he was different, because he lived outside the boundaries of normal society. But the law required proof, and proof was absent. The jury deliberated for 3 days. The length of deliberation suggested disagreement among the jurors, debate about whether the evidence met the standard required for conviction. Finally, on May 5, 1988, the jury returned with a verdict. Andre Rand was found guilty of kidnapping in the first degree in the case of Jennifer Schweiger. The courtroom erupted in reactions. Jennifer's family wept with relief and grief. Rand showed no visible emotion. His attorney immediately announced plans to appeal. Sentencing was scheduled for several weeks later. Judge Sheedy imposed the maximum sentence allowed under law, 25 years to life in prison. Rand would be eligible for parole after serving 25 years, meaning his earliest possible release would be in 2010. He was 54 years old at sentencing. If he served the minimum, he would be nearly 80 before release became a possibility. The conviction in Jennifer's case gave prosecutors confidence to pursue charges in the earlier disappearances. In 2004, 17 years after Jennifer's death, Andre Rand was tried for the kidnapping of Holly Ann Hughes. The delay had been caused by multiple factors: appeals in the Jennifer case, difficulties gathering evidence in an old case where witnesses had scattered and memories had faded, and prosecutorial decisions about whether a conviction could be obtained given the lack of physical evidence. The trial for Holly Ann's kidnapping followed a similar pattern to the Jennifer trial. The prosecution relied on circumstantial evidence and witness testimony. The witnesses who had placed Rand near Holly Ann's apartment complex in 1981 testified, now identifying him more than 20 years after the alleged sightings. The defense attacked their credibility, arguing that 2 decades had elapsed and her memories over such spans were unreliable at best and fabricated at worst. The prosecution presented evidence of Rand's presence at Willowbrook in 1981, establishing that he had been in the area and had the opportunity to commit the crime. The defense struggled with the same problems they had faced in the first trial. Their client could not or would not provide an alibi. He could not explain his movements on the day Holly Ann disappeared. He had no witnesses who could testify on his behalf. His appearance and lifestyle made him unsympathetic to jurors who struggled to see past his strangeness to evaluate the evidence objectively. The jury in the Holly Ann case deliberated for 2 days before returning a guilty verdict on June 14, 2004. Rand was convicted of kidnapping in the first degree. The judge sentenced him to an additional 25 years to life, to be served consecutively with the sentence from Jennifer's case. The consecutive sentences meant Rand would have to serve at least 50 years before becoming eligible for parole, effectively ensuring he would die in prison given his age. The convictions brought some measure of closure to Jennifer's and Holly Ann's families, though closure is perhaps the wrong word for something that can never be fully resolved. Their daughters were still gone. The pain of loss did not diminish with verdicts, but there was relief in knowing that someone had been held accountable, that the man responsible would not be free to harm other children, that justice, incomplete and imperfect as it was, had been served to the extent the legal system allowed. The cases of Alice Pereira and Tia-Hees Jackson remained officially unsolved. Prosecutors considered bringing charges against Rand for their disappearances, but the evidence was even weaker than in Holly Ann's case. Without credible witnesses or physical evidence, conviction seemed unlikely. The decision was made to leave those cases open rather than risk acquittals that would foreclose future prosecution if new evidence emerged. Rand maintained his silence through both trials and in the years that followed. He never confessed. He never explained what had happened to the girls or where their bodies might be found. His refusal to speak meant that families of the missing children remained without the answers they desperately needed. They knew or suspected Rand was responsible, but suspicion is not the same as certainty, and without bodies, without confirmation, the wounds could not fully heal. The legend of Cropsey had found its conclusion in the courtroom. The campfire tale had become trial testimony. The hook-handed madman had become a flesh-and-blood defendant serving life sentences, but the legend's transformation into reality brought no satisfaction beyond the basic requirement of justice. The children were still gone. The families still grieved. And Staten Island, the forgotten borough at the edge of New York City, would carry the weight of what had happened for generations to come. The Willowbrook ruins still stood, monuments to failure and suffering, and in those buildings, the echoes of the past remained, whispering of crimes committed and children lost, of justice sought and questions that would never be fully answered. Chapter 10. The Memory of Monsters. The years passed slowly for Andre Rand in prison. He was transferred to the Southport Correctional Facility in upstate New York, a maximum security institution where inmates serving long sentences were housed far from the communities where their crimes had been committed. The distance was intentional, designed to prevent escape attempts and to insulate the surrounding area from the presence of dangerous offenders. Rand settled into the routines that define prison existence. Meals at specified times, recreation in controlled environments, work assignments that filled the endless hours, nights in a cell where silence was rarely complete. He aged behind those walls, his hair turning completely white, his body growing thinner and more fragile as years accumulated. He spoke little to other inmates. Those who tried to engage him found him uncommunicative or incoherent, his responses disconnected from questions asked. He formed no friendships, joined no groups, avoided the social hierarchies that structure prison life. He was isolated by choice and by necessity. Child predators occupy the lowest rung of prison society, targets for violence from other inmates who view crimes against children as unforgivable even among the condemned. Rand spent much of his time in protective custody, separated from the general population for his own safety. The isolation that had characterized his years at Willowbrook continued in prison, but now the walls that surrounded him were locked from the outside. His first parole hearing was scheduled for 2013, 25 years after his conviction in Jennifer Schweiger's case. The hearing was largely a formality. Inmates serving life sentences rarely receive parole at their first hearing, especially when convicted of crimes against children. The parole board's decision depends on multiple factors: behavior in prison, participation in rehabilitation programs, acceptance of responsibility for crimes, and assessment of risk to public safety if released. Rand's record was mixed. He had no major disciplinary infractions, but neither had he participated meaningfully in programs designed to address the issues that led to his crimes. He had never admitted guilt. He had never expressed remorse. When asked about his crimes during the parole hearing, he maintained the same silence he had maintained for decades. The hearing also included input from victims' families. Jennifer Schweiger's parents submitted statements opposing Rand's release. They described the continuing impact of their daughter's death on their lives. They noted that Jennifer's body had been recovered, allowing them to bury her and visit her grave, but that other families had not received even that small mercy. Holly Ann Hughes's mother appeared at the hearing in person, now elderly and frail, but determined to ensure the board understood her opposition to release. She spoke about the 26 years that had passed since her daughter's disappearance, about the birthdays and holidays marked by absence, about the knowledge that Holly Ann's body remained hidden somewhere, unrecovered despite searches. She asked the board to consider what message would be sent if Rand were released, while refusing to provide information about where the missing girls might be found. The parole board denied release. The decision was unanimous. Rand would remain in prison and could apply again for parole in 2 years. The outcome was expected, but families of the missing girls attended or submitted statements at each subsequent hearing to ensure their voices were part of the process. Rand was denied parole in 2015, 2017, 2009, and in every hearing that followed. Each denial brought temporary relief to the families, but also the knowledge that they would have to repeat this process again in 2 years, reopening wounds that never quite healed. Staten Island itself changed gradually in the decades after Rand's conviction. The borough grew more populous and more expensive. Neighborhoods that had been working class became middle class. The Verrazano Narrows Bridge, which had long been the only direct connection to Brooklyn, was joined by improved ferry service and eventually discussions of additional transit links. The Fresh Kills landfill closed in 2001, the mountains of garbage that had defined the borough's landscape being transformed slowly into parkland. The changes brought new residents who had no memory of the missing children, who had never heard the legend of Cropsey told around campfires, who knew Willowbrook only as a name attached to abandoned buildings visible from the highway. But memory persisted among long-time residents. Parents who had been children in the 1980s told their own children about Cropsey when warning them to be careful. The story was updated for new generations, adapted to reflect what was now known about Rand while maintaining the essential elements that made it effective as both cautionary tale and local mythology. The legend had been true after all, parents explained, which meant other dangers might be real as well. Stay aware. Trust your instincts. Tell an adult if someone makes you uncomfortable. The lessons embedded in the legend transcended the specifics of the case. The Willowbrook grounds remained undeveloped for years after Rand's arrest. The buildings continued to decay, their roofs collapsing, their walls covered in graffiti, their interiors increasingly dangerous as floors rotted and ceilings fell. Security was improved somewhat after Jennifer's body was discovered there, with better fencing and more frequent patrols, but the property was too large to secure completely. Teenagers still found ways to enter, still explored the ruins, still told each other stories about what had happened there both in the institution's operational years and after its closure. The state discussed various plans for the property: demolition and redevelopment, conversion to parkland, sale to private developers. But each plan faced obstacles. The cost of demolition was enormous given the number and size of the buildings. Environmental contamination from decades of institutional use made any redevelopment expensive. and the association with both the Willowbrook scandal and the Rand crimes made the property difficult to market for any purpose. Eventually, in the early 2000s, demolition began on some of the buildings. The process was slow and incremental, limited by budget constraints and the technical challenges of safely demolishing large structures that had been built to last. One by one, buildings came down, the rubble hauled away, the land leveled and left empty. Other buildings remained standing, too expensive to demolish or deemed potentially salvageable for future use that never quite materialized. As of the 2020s, portions of the Willowbrook site had been converted to parkland and a college campus, but some abandoned structures still stood, fenced off and slowly collapsing, monuments to what had happened there and what could not be undone. The families of the missing girls continued their own battles with memory and grief. Alice Pereira's parents died without ever learning what had happened to their daughter or where her body might be found. They went to their graves carrying the hope, irrational but inextinguishable, that somehow Alice might still be alive, that the mystery might still be resolved in their lifetime. Their other children inherited the burden of uncertainty, continuing to mark Alice's birthday each year, continuing to hope for closure that seemed increasingly unlikely as decades passed. Holly Ann Hughes's mother persisted in her search long past the point when most people would have surrendered to grief and moved on. She hired private investigators when police resources were no longer dedicated to the case. She followed up on tips from people claiming to know where Holly Ann was buried. She consulted psychics and participated in searches organised by volunteer groups dedicated to finding missing persons. None of these efforts produced results, but the act of searching itself had value, providing purpose and structure to days that might otherwise have been consumed by despair. When she became too old to conduct active searches, she maintained a website with information about Holly Ann's case, updating it regularly, ensuring that her daughter would not be forgotten, even as public attention moved on to newer tragedies. Tia Hiazi Jackson's family had fewer resources and less public platform for keeping their daughter's case visible. They marked anniversaries privately, gathering to remember Tia Hiazi on her birthday and on the day she disappeared. They followed news about Rand, attending his parole hearings when possible, submitting statements when attendance was not. They held on to faith that somehow, someday, they would learn what had happened to their daughter. The waiting became a way of life, something that defined them even as they tried to move forward. Documentary filmmakers and true crime writers became interested in the cases as years passed. The connection between the legend of Cropsey and the reality of Andre Rand's crimes made the story compelling to those who examined the intersection of folklore and criminal behaviour. A documentary titled Cropsey was released in 2009, examining the legend's origins and its relationship to Rand's crimes. The film brought renewed attention to the cases and to the unresolved questions about the missing girls. It also sparked debate about whether media attention on such cases was helpful or harmful, whether keeping the stories alive served the interests of justice or merely exploited tragedy for entertainment. Some who viewed the documentary or read about the cases remained unconvinced of Rand's guilt. They noted the weakness of the evidence, the reliance on circumstantial connections and unreliable witness identifications. They argued that Rand had been convicted because he was an easy target, someone whose appearance and lifestyle made him unsympathetic to juries who wanted to believe justice had been served. The alternative, they suggested, was that the real perpetrator had never been caught, that Rand was serving life sentences for crimes he did not commit while the actual predator had escaped accountability. But most who examined the evidence, including investigators and prosecutors who had worked the cases, remained confident that Rand was responsible not only for the 2 kidnappings for which he had been convicted, but also for the disappearances of Alice and Tia Hiazi and possibly other missing children, whose cases had never been conclusively connected to him. The pattern was too clear, the circumstances too consistent. A predator had operated on Staten Island for at least 15 years, taking young girls and hiding their bodies so effectively that most were never found. Rand had been present throughout that period. He had lived in a location ideally suited for concealing remains. He had no alibi for the disappearances and no explanation for his movements on the relevant dates. His conviction for Jennifer's kidnapping, where the body had been found, established that he was capable of such crimes. The logical conclusion was that he had committed the others as well. The question that haunted everyone involved was where the bodies of the missing girls were located. Rand knew if he was indeed responsible, but he had never indicated any willingness to share that information. Multiple searches of the Willowbrook grounds over the years had failed to produce additional remains. Either the bodies were buried in locations that had not been searched, or they were disposed of elsewhere on Staten Island, or they had been moved at some point and were now beyond recovery. Without Rand's cooperation, which showed no signs of being forthcoming, the girls would likely remain missing. As the 2020s arrived, Andre Rand was in his late 70s, elderly and in declining health. His next parole hearing was scheduled for 2025 and the one after that for 2027. The cycle would continue until either he died in prison or the parole board concluded that he no longer posed a threat to public safety. Release seemed increasingly unlikely as he aged, and as the consecutive sentences meant he would have to serve 50 years before the second sentence could be considered completed. The mathematics of his age and his sentences made it probable that he would die incarcerated, never having admitted guilt, never having provided the answers that families desperately needed. The legend of Cropsey evolved in the years since Rand's conviction. The story told around campfires now included the real events, blurring fiction and fact until they were nearly inseparable. Children listening to the tale heard about a hook-handed madman and about Andre Rand, the two figures merging into a single mythology that served the same purpose the original legend had served. Teaching caution, establishing boundaries, giving shape to fears that exist with or without it, names attached to them. The legend was stronger for having been proven partially true, his power enhanced by the knowledge that monsters are not always imaginary. Staten Island continued to carry the weight of what had happened. The borough would always be known among those who remembered as the place where Cropsey became real, the place where children disappeared and were not found, the place where an institution that had failed thousands of vulnerable children in life became the setting for the failure to protect other children in death. The memory was painful and permanent, woven into the community's identity in ways that would persist for generations. In the end, the story of Andre Rand and the missing children of Staten Island was not a story with a satisfying conclusion. Justice had been partially served through convictions and imprisonment, but justice is incomplete when bodies remain missing and questions remain unanswered. The families continued to grieve, to hope, to wait. The legend continued to be told, adapted and updated but retaining its essential power. The ruins of Willowbrook, those that still stood, continued to decay, whispering of suffering both past and present. And in a prison far from Staten Island, an old man who had once lived in those ruins sat in silence, carrying secrets he showed no sign of sharing, existing in a space between memory and forgetting where time moved slowly and consequences stretched across decades without relief or resolution. The campfire burned low. The stories ended without ending, trailing off into silence that was heavy with all that remained unsaid. And the children who heard the tales went home to their beds, perhaps sleeping less soundly than before, perhaps understanding a little better that the monsters in the stories were real enough, and that caution was not merely advised but necessary. The legend of Cropsey had taught its lesson well. Some warnings are warnings because they are true. The candles burned low. The halls of history grew quiet once more, and the stories, like all dark stories, settled into memory where they would wait, patient and unchanging, for the next listener who would dare to hear them whispered in the dark.